You've been hiking this mountain for what feels like ages. Your cold and weary fingers reach for the last gripping stone and you pull yourself up. On the horizon, you see the legendary city of Gold Bricks. Now, that's a terrible name, so that's why we're here today to dive into what makes good location names. This is going to be a complete guide, so stick around for the entire video. We're going to be covering basically everything. By the time you're done this guide, you'll be able to name locations like Christopher Columbus. I don't know, I just made that up right now. I'm not even sure if he really named anything, did he? Maybe West Indies? I don't know, that's why I'm a writer. I'm not a historian or anything, so let's just get right into it. The setting will influence your naming conventions. You don't want to be calling this bar in like futuristic Tokyo the Old Iron Inn, right? Because it just doesn't match the theme, it doesn't match the setting. So just keep that in mind. We'll dive into more of this later on, so stick around for that. But without further ado, we'll just get into the second part. You have to seek inspiration from real world locations and other works of fiction. Explore the cultural, historical, or geographical context that can help shape location names. So, like for example, you could draw inspiration from like the Legend of Avalon if you are in like this medieval fantasy world, right? Because you researched your topic, which was like medieval fantasy, you came upon the Legend of King Arthur and the island of Avalon. So you could name a village in your fantasy world Avaloria. That's just like, one of many examples on how you can take inspiration from different things that are already well known, such as like King Arthur. Then you also want to consider like the cultural significance of your characters and your locations. These could be names that reflect history, traditions, and a language of a place. So for example, a character from Japan might name their garden like Yujin Tien. This would like use a Japanese name that carries a sense of mystery and depth. It isn't like this Japanese character would be calling his garden some Korean name. So these location names should carry some sort of meaning to them. It would also show who was there before, right? So say if this garden lasts for hundreds of years, we can still trace back its origin to someone who is Japanese because they used the Japanese language. So that also adds like some sort of historical context to it. If we want to say have a location that's hundreds of years old, we can still give it like a Japanese name to show that it was like founded by samurai or something like that if you want. This brings us to the next step, which is descriptive or symbolic naming. These names can describe the location's characteristics or hold symbolic meaning related to the story. So say in a post-apocalyptic setting, you could name a hideout called like New Eden or Eden's Hope, symbolizing the belief of a better future, right? So many of us know the story of, the Garden of Eden. It was a perfect place. This could be, New Eden, another perfect place within all the desolation. Now, this next step or tip is especially important for like fantasy worlds. It's not so important for historical or futuristic worlds or present day worlds. This is more about fantasy. You have to use consistency. Establish rules or patterns for naming locations and stick to them unless there's a compelling reason to deviate. So, for example, in a fantasy world, you could use a consistent pattern for naming all the elf towns ending in Thor, such as Silver Thor or Eagle Thor or Thor, right? It doesn't matter, but this like ending adds like this consistency so that even just by hearing the name of the location once, if your reader already knows a couple of elven towns that have a name ending in Thor, they can draw the conclusion that, okay, this new town that they're going to, that they really don't know a whole lot about, is probably going to be inhabited by elves. Now, depending if it's like sci-fi or fantasy, some of these names are going to be super hard to pronounce, so it's always a good idea to include like a bit of character dialogue where there's one character who knows the actual pronunciation of the name while the other character is asking for the pronunciation. This way, you can show your character how to pronounce it without directly telling them. So you could have this character asking where this planet Zilothri is. Now the other character chuckles, saying like that's not how you pronounce it, and then the character goes syllable by syllable, explaining to the other character how to pronounce it. Instead of just saying like, okay, on the map there's this is how to pronounce it. It adds more action, it adds more flavor by having your characters talk about the pronunciation. If this is needed, obviously you should try to stay away from overly complicated names, because then they just kind of sound super made up without any actual significance. So just keep that in mind. Now, this upcoming tip is a mistake that I made many, many times when I first started writing, and it was not using unique names for each location. We want your readers to be able to tell these locations apart. So, for example, you don't want to have two different locations, one being called the Council of Elders and the other one being called the Elder Circle. They sound too similar, and honestly, they could be synonymous with each other. This is going to confuse the readers and just make a very messy narrative if they think that you're going to the same place where they already are. So just keep that in mind and make sure that all the names are either unique enough to tell them apart from each other or at least not synonymous. Right, like the Council of Elders and the Elder Circle is basically the same thing. Now the next one is to avoid stereotypes. You want to be respectful of some cultures and avoid using stereotypes in your names. You don't have to overdo this, but it is important, say if you're writing about Native Americans, to research a little bit about their actual naming patterns and not just, name some random chief running bear when you don't fully understand the meaning of that name. See, honestly, I don't even fully understand the meaning of that name, right? I think it has something to do, once this baby's born, the father goes to look outside, and the first thing that he sees, I'm not sure how many bears. I mean, it seems like a lot of these Native Americans are named after bears, in these stories at least. So you want to be mindful of that and have something more realistic and more respectful of the culture. Now, also, another thing is to just simply seek feedback. You can ask me, I'm a writing coach. We can book a call down below. Feel free to do that. But really, just by asking, your relatives, family, friends, you can learn so much about how you should name your locations. You could ask them, okay, so for this city, it's with elves, but then there's also orcs living on the outside. What should I call it? Right? And then you can give them a couple options to choose from. I remember one time in this book that I wrote, there was this location called Ursidum, right? Standing for the Ursidae, which is the scientific name for the bear species. But one of my family members mispronounced it as "you're so dumb," right? So it was almost like a hidden joke there, saying to the readers that you're so dumb. So obviously I had to look into changing that because I didn't want that confusion to distract from the actual narrative. But if that's what you want, if you want some confusion here and there for a very random story, then go right ahead. But you have been warned. And also, I mean, this is a pretty obvious one, but just don't be stealing anybody's names. Check for trademarks. You don't want to be calling something Starbucksburg when there's obviously a Starbucks. It just doesn't work like that. Don't do it. Again, you have been warned. And now the last tip of this guide is that you should feel free to evolve your names, right? You should evolve them as the locations change. You don't have to do this for all locations, but it does help for some to just kind of keep up with the current times, right? So for example, you could have this village called Hope's Rest. It could eventually become New Beginning as the community changes and rebuilds. Also, you might get caught up naming all these locations and accidentally name the same location the same thing as another location that you already have. So I find it helpful to have a little map. You can watch my 5 tips on world building. I talk a bit more about map creation there. But a map, with all the different locations on it, or really just a list of all the different locations with maybe a little bit of information on each one, just so that you know which ones are which, and maybe you can start, building patterns. Like all the elf towns could end in Thor, and all the orc towns could end in Scale or something, orc scale or whatever. This is your story. But with that being said, if you do want some coaching, we can book a free call down below. We can cover, writing your first chapter. I'll actually walk side by side with you as you get started with that. We can cover world building, character development, really anything that you want help with. We can cover that in 30 minutes. Totally free introductory call. I'd be happy to see you there. And that really just ends this guide. Remember that naming locations is a creative process, and there aren't really any strict rules. The names you choose should enhance the story and add to the richness. It should never make it complicated or take away from the reader's enjoyment by having to pronounce all these weird names. Again, look for feedback from either me, your friends, your family, really anyone who's going to listen about what these locations should be called. I'm sure that you'll find a lot of help there. Honestly, naming locations was probably one of my favorite parts in the world building of my story. So I'll see you in the next one. Book a call down below with me. We'll get to talking there and honestly get you writing as quickly as possible so that you can publish your book as quickly as possible. I'll see you in the next one.